Hey, welcome to Lab the Podcast. Grateful for the opportunity to share some time again with Lyric Gillett, my friend and a podcast guest from before. Lyric's the founder and executive director of Faces of Choice, an organization birthed to bring awareness to a demographic of survivors that's gone largely unnoticed, those who were aborted but survived. Her mission is to change the international cultural conversation about abortion through the voices of survivors by bringing the world face to face with the reality of choice. Lyric, so good to see you. It's been a while since you were on the podcast, but great to see you. Thanks for being back.
Thank you so much for having me on, Zach. It was incredible last time, and I'm looking forward to this dialogue today.
Last time we were pretty fresh off a trip. Cami and I had gone over to Oxford, England. We were there, and that's how we met. And you were kind enough to give us a tour, and that was the context that we met each other. And in that conversation, I was struck with a particular quality about you, that you have a courage about you that's rare. And to watch you lean into what God has called you to was extraordinarily beautiful. We say on this podcast all the time, we're trying to find evidence, pictures, stories of people whose lives and work give us a glimpse at the life and beauty of the gospel. And sometimes that can feel flowery. People hear that, oh, that's nice, the life and beauty of the gospel. But there is a force to the kingdom of God, to the reality of the gospel, bringing light into dark places that is really, it's gentle, but it's powerful and it's transformative. And you're doing that work, you're embodying that work in the world through your organization. So thank you for who you are. Catch me up. You're not at Oxford today. You're in the States. So catch us up and maybe bring us into the moment for Faces of Choice. You're here and you're on the ground on this side of the pond, so to speak. So give us a quick update on how you're doing and where is Faces of Choice today, on this side of our previous conversation.
Well, you're right, Zach. Don't let the bookshelves fool you, anybody. I'm home at my parents' home, and there are bookshelves. And Faces of Choice right now is at a place that I could have only prayed for 6 years ago. I was looking back before talking with you on a video interview that I did with one of the survivors, Melissa Oden of the Abortion Survivors Network. And this interview was right in the throes of COVID. And we were talking about the fact that we didn't really know where the Lord was going to take this because of the shutdown and how the world at large had changed. And I saw that I had just quipped, well, maybe one day we'll go to the World Cup. Maybe we'll end up at the World Cup in 2022. And I was just laughing because the end of that interview was talking about how the Lord's timing is always perfect, how things don't seem that they're lining up the way that we would like them to, and that there's disappointment and discouragement. And sometimes it does feel that the darkness is encroaching in an almost final sort of way. Excuse me. And when you look at survivors of abortion, that's almost true from the beginning of their story, that the darkness encroached in such a way that it almost took their lives from them. But at the end of the day, life empowers, and the author of life and truth is Christ. And so that really is the focus here. And so, all those years ago, 2019 is when this started. 2020 is when our Super Bowl ad was rejected last minute by the network just days before. And that did seem like darkness, at least for a time, had one part of that engagement. But today, I can't. I'm blown away to announce where the Lord has taken us. We have received network approvals from both hosting networks to air our ad for the 2026 World Cup. And what is so exceptional about this, Zach, is that when we were trying to court the system for the Super Bowl, we were looking at an audience of about 100 million Americans. And that's great. That's a lot of people. At the time, that seemed unfathomable to me. But the World Cup is different. The World Cup is the table at which the entire world gathers, in a sense. And we're looking at an audience that ranges between 1.5 billion, that's billion with a B, to 5 billion people. That's the majority of the world's population. And the ability to bring Faces of Choice to this audience and to tell the world, which has always been the goal, it's been to change the cultural conversation about abortion kind of in a William Wilberforce style, where it's not just through legislation, it's not just through strong arming what needs to happen. It's rather through changing hearts and minds, because until that happens, until we move away from a culture of death and embrace a culture that actually values life for what it is, created in the image of God, this is just going to be circling the drain. And so we have a chance now to bring the message of faces of choice, which is that choice is not just a word, choice is a person with a face and a name and a story of survival. We can now bring that message to the world. And again, for viewers who may not have seen the previous podcast, Faces of Choice started to highlight children who were aborted while they were still in their mother's wombs. That's what we mean by abortion survivors. Real men and women who are alive today who survived the abortion process. And that's surgical abortions, where you can look on our website. Some of these individuals were survivors of abortions where, um, as Josiah describes it, who's actually missing an arm today, the fetus was pulled apart in the mother's womb and brought out in pieces. And we believe that's why he's missing his arm today, because he survived that abortion. We're talking about other types of abortions, like a saline infusion abortion that is meant to poison and scald the fetus to death. Melissa Oden, the face of the Abortion Survivors Network, has survived that process. So we are trying to bring a story of truth, but also rooted in empathy. Because I'm convinced that when a survivor looks you in the eye and tells you their story, a paradigm shift takes place that changes everything. And we see that through history. We see that when Rosa Parks and MLK became the face of the civil rights movement, the conversation changed. That story of surviving changed things. Even after the Holocaust, when Ali Wiesel came out of Auschwitz and humanized the inhumanity of what transpired in that camp, that changed the dialogue. So that's what we're looking to do. But again, the goal has moved from changing that conversation in America, which is very important to me, but to changing it throughout the entire world. So the goal is to bring a culture of life to supplant and encroach upon the culture of death.
Yeah. People just listening to you right there will pick up on that note of courage that I referenced earlier. This is a huge fight, and to change that paradigm, to shift that conversation, like an audacious goal, and this new campaign to shift from just a Super Bowl ad to now a global audience. I want to talk more about that, but for everybody listening, uh, we care about life, obviously. And it's not just for the sake of, oh, well, we're supposed to, right? Like, why is V3 having this conversation? Why are we having this conversation again and highlighting it? For us, the poetry of God is human life, right? It's in Ephesians. God's poema, like He has made us in His image. There's a dignity of life issue within the Christian conviction that it is a foundational tenet to the Christian faith, human life has dignity and worth and majesty. We're fearfully, wonderfully made, and it begins at conception, and that something incredible is taking place in the world with every single human life. Just that confession, we're made in the image of God. If you imagine the creator bringing to life the artistry of God. The heavens declare the glory of God. All these different places we see the beauty of God, but in each human face, you see something that doesn't exist. There's only one of those in the entire world, this incredible being made by the hands of God. That's what we're talking about with life. And if you imagine how much, like, V3 is commissioning art and trying to do all this beauty all over the world, imagine if people were just tearing down and discarding these things that we make, how tragic that would be. That's what we're literally watching, generation after generation of God's majesty and beauty be wiped out. And what I see in you, Lyric, is that you are courageous enough to stand up and say, we can't allow it. Like, we have to change this conversation and shift it. I want to go back to the first conversation we had and introduce people to the strategy, because you were very thoughtful and you said, you've thought a lot about how do we make that shift, and that why is it so important that we bring this really kind of forgotten voice in the debate about choice, right? We have this voice and we have this voice, but you were really clear in the way that you were thinking that there's a part of that conversation that's missing. Why is that so important, and what undergirds that philosophy for you?
Thank you for highlighting that, Zach. There's something that I've coined the hierarchy of the right to speak. And you see this all throughout culture. And this idea stems from the concept that your experiential relationship to something is what gives you permission to speak about that thing. Now, I don't agree with that. I don't agree that just because you have an experiential connection to something, that's the only thing that allows you to speak to it. If that were the case, then when we're having this entire conversation, for instance, about slavery, then really only slave owners should be able to control the power dynamic in that dialogue. The slaves weren't going to have any bargaining power. So the experiential relationship to that is simply the people who were slaveholders. We don't hold to that. But what we're doing in the culture right now is we're saying that only the woman who has had an abortion should have any say in the conversation about abortion. That men are at the very bottom of this hierarchy because they're not capable of being pregnant. And that as you move up this hierarchy, you have the woman who's never been pregnant, the woman who was pregnant but didn't want an abortion. Above her, you could have the woman who maybe wrestled with that. But at the very top of this hierarchy of the right to speak is the woman who had an abortion. Now, again, I think the component of that, excuse me, is fallacious. But if we're going to operate off of that metric, then the woman who has had an abortion is not at the top of that hierarchy. Rather, it is the child who was aborted and survived the process. And so we've seen how our culture has navigated um, in the past half decade the Me Too movement or the Believe All Survivors movement. And unfortunately, right now, we're in a place where we're really only moving culture in terms of emotion. And a lot of that emotion can be selfish, but we really are a very emotionally driven culture right now. And so, a big part of the strategy was to say that empathy is where we need to start, to where you are forced to look a survivor in the eye. Because let's think about this. The kind of the tagline of Faces of choice is not merely a word, choice is a person. So let's logically work through this. If you say that you are pro-choice and you look a survivor of abortion in the eye and you say I supported your mother's choice, they represent the failure of that choice not coming to play. So, what you are in effect saying is that you do not support their survival because their survival stood in contravention of their mother's choice. So, if you are pro choice, that means that you're against the abortion survivor. And I think that framing the conversation in that context to where people do have to come face to face with the reality of choice, to where people do have to look a survivor in the eye and actually hear their story, especially in our current cultural context. Not to mention, like we just talked about, that there is historical precedence for survivors changing that narrative. But especially today, where the emotion du jour is what drives everything, I think that has the capacity to change quite a bit about this conversation. And, I think another important component that a lot of people don't talk about is how much the post-abortive woman suffers as well. Many are not informed. They're not talked to about the biological dynamics that change, much less the psychological, physiological, how the suicide rate goes up, how the breast cancer incidents go up. There's a lot of suffering there. And after I launched Faces of Choice, I actually had a lot of post-abortive women emailing me and saying, when we saw that this campaign was about children who survived abortion, we were scared because we didn't know what kind of condemnation was going to come in that conversation. But instead, what happened, Zach, on the website and on the YouTube channel, each survivor has their own personal story outside of the main commercials that we have. And so, what happened is these women were able to go online and watch these stories and see that almost every single one of these survivors have stories of reconciliation with their birth mothers. Most of them were adopted, but all of the ones really who were able to reconcile with their mothers and say, I love you, I forgive you, I'm so glad that things didn't work out the way that you chose initially, and that we're able to meet and engage with each other and be part of one another's lives. And so even post-abortive women are able to find healing. So when you bring life in, when you bring and life with a capital L that emanates from its creator, when you bring that in, it's an actual healing element. If you want to talk about how and light actually kind of excoriate the wound, but then provide healing, that's kind of what's going on here. And so you're right, it is strategic. It is based on the cultural heartbeat, if you will, and how we seem to progress as a culture. But there's also thought to the healing process and how that can come together in wholeness in the end. Because when you value life, as they say, from womb to tomb, and I love that terminology, but when you do that and when you revere that Imago Dei appropriately, your value for yourself and your value for others really transforms the way you interact with the world. And that doesn't just affect concepts like abortion or euthanasia. That also affects everything in the middle, from human trafficking to, spousal abuse or anything in between. This has the power to transform if we stop undermining the initial value of life from conception.
Yeah. No, thank you for going back and highlighting that, because I think the way you approached it, knowing the power of just how we are as humans to connect and bond over emotion and meet each other in that space, not under attending to that, is really, really important. And at the same time, from a rational perspective, saying this is the way we've made this argument. And there's a way, even if it's flawed, in the way that we've approached this. Okay, we can meet you in that. And even from that perspective, we can introduce a new voice that changes the paradigm. I think it's a brilliant strategy. I think it is healing. I think it's one of the reasons why we were so moved to say we want to highlight the work that you're doing and who you are, because it is really well thought out, well reasoned. And there's the courage to take on a big goal and to say, okay, if we're right about this lever, and if we're right about taking this step, then there's a strategy that we can employ, and we need to go for it. And I want to talk about what that looks like going for it. But before we do, there's a timing element too. And we have to consider the times and understand, like, why is now the time to take this shot and to maybe go for that big goal and the big opportunity. Has something shifted? I feel like there is a change. I've been in a pastor for a long time. I've been in conversations, really thoughtful people on both sides of the abortion conversation for 20 plus years, listening to kind of how we have moved as a culture. And what I love right now, and I will say this, right? And this is probably provocative on all fronts, but I think there is a shift from a culture of death to a culture of life. And we're wrestling through that, right? Immigration's a part of that. What's our approach to neighbors, others, nations? We're not getting it all right, right? We're all wrestling through and trying to figure it out. But underneath it, there is a golden thread that I see of we are moving to life matters and human life matters. And like you said, from womb to tomb, however we're talking about domestic survivors, human trafficking, immigration, euthanasia, like every part of this conversation seems to me to be touched with a little bit more of a lean towards a culture of life. Is that optimistic, or are you seeing that as well? Do you feel like we're at a tipping point, or maybe a shift in the way that the next generations are thinking about life? Is something moved?
I do sense a shift, and I think the mere fact that we were approved this round to run our ad during the World Cup, whereas before we were completely blocked out, even in the business sense, there has been a shift. And the thing is, though, Zach, I will say that I think the Lord brings each and every person into a context of for such a time as this. I don't think there's just one Esther. I think that everyone has that spirit animated inside of them, and that there's a choice to step forward or not. And the reason that I'm saying this is because if you look through the course of history, whether you're looking back toward the times of Moloch, when there was child sacrifice happening, and the reason that that was happening in some part was to say we have to keep a system of order. There was a huge part of that. And you can go forward throughout all of slavery, not just in our continent, but throughout all of history. You do see that there's this ebb and flow of valuing life and not valuing life, or at least valuing it more. I don't think we've ever gotten to the full extent of what that should be. I mean, that's the brokenness of our human condition. But if we're noting that ebb and flow, I do think that we're at a more positive crest, if you will, right now. But it reminds me of what Reagan said, President Reagan, that we're only ever one generation away from extinction, and it must be passed, on through teaching. It's not just some kind of intrinsic thing that passes on through your bloodline. And so, yes, I do believe that we're at a cultural shift, more towards life. But I don't think that that's something that once we get all the definitions in line, that it's just going to stick and stay. This is something that has to be perpetually taught. And that's something I like actually about the Hebrew tradition, where it talks in scripture about how you're supposed to sit down with your family and you're supposed to go through the history and how God actually rescued the Jewish people time and time again throughout scripture. And I think that's something that we as a culture miss, that we're so focused on the moment and the time and the place that we're in right now. And we don't actually sit down at our tables with our family and our children and our parents and have this conversation, this multi-generational perspective of life. And so I think that we are at a better place and we're at a pivotal place because again, um, we have a worldwide audience, which is not something that we've ever been afforded before. This is quite frankly insane to just have the most basic way of saying it, to have an audience like this. And so I do think that's why it's so important that we step out now and take hold of this, because that the cultural ebb and flow can definitely be shifted more towards a trajectory. I mean, in general, we understand that slavery is not a good thing as a culture. And I think we're moving further and further away from that. Not to say that there's not many countries that are still practicing this, or that modern day slavery in a human trafficking sense is extremely prevalent now. But at least we can say as a culture, and we're not really moving away from that to any extent that I can see, slavery is not a good thing. And so the hope is that although there is this ebb and flow that we will always be battling, that we can at least shift culture enough to say, life is valuable from conception. This is a human, and that we never really fall back into that narrative again of it's not a human. Let's at least come to this dialogue in an intellectually honest way, where if people are going to make the choice, that you know what you are choosing is to end a human life. Let's at least have enough of that shift to where you know from abortion survivors, this is a human being, and this is what an abortion survivor grows up to look like.
Mm.
So
I
that's what I'm trying to at least shift.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it's so important because if we can get upstream, so to speak, and start at conception and say, let's talk about human life. And these are real people, right? Like they would not exist. Here's their story, here's their face. Know them, listen to the sound and cadence of their voice, see the animation of their features. Like this is a human life. And this story begins with that first origin story of theirs at conception, and it blossoms into this human person. Recovering that as a starting point opens the door for us to have honest conversations about every other form of slavery, trafficking, immigration, all the things that we're passionate about. If we can go upstream and agree on this, then we can have honest dialogue about all these other things. And we're not marking like, well, we can only have this, if they're mining lead for batteries, right? Like, and they're out of our view, that's not a human, right? If they don't have or this is not a human, or that's not a human, we're not having that. We can globally say, hey, these are the faces of human life, and shift the conversation to let's start there. I think that's why your strategy is so important. And I do feel like the moment you have a global audience. So I want to get to the big goal, because for everybody listening, this is what we see, the life and beauty of the gospel in the world, right? We put a frame around it. Buechner says art invites us to pay attention. And what I want everybody to pay attention to is these things don't just happen. Yes, we all have our Esther moment, but Lyric has seen this opportunity, this calling for her to stand up in this space, the opportunity to shift the conversation in a well-reasoned way. And then somehow the doors have opened now for you to literally have an audience with major networks who are saying, we will green light the opportunity to introduce this story to a global audience. Like, this is extraordinary that you are literally standing. I mean, today after this call, you will literally sit down to talk about how do we move forward to execute on bringing that story to our moment globally. So everybody listening, this is extraordinary. This is why we're putting a frame around it. I'm watching go in absolute awe, going, I cannot believe that you have this opportunity. When you go into these conversations with the media, does it surprise you? Like, do you pinch yourself ever and go, how did I get here?
It really does. And not to go into too much detail, but one of the individuals that was part of the approval process this time was part of the rejection process last time. In fact, was one of the main actors in preventing things from going forward. So This clearly, the pinching myself is clearly knowing that this is the Lord moving. And I'm just reminded of the verse that says that the king's heart is like water in the Lord's hand, and he will move it wherever he wants. So it's again just tying back to the concept of encroaching darkness. And it's why, Zach, I was reading recently a devotional talking about how there's almost a moral imperative in scripture towards hope. It's not just that, we can convince ourselves through some weak minded machinations that we should hope. Rather, it's that the Lord has called us to hope. And that's why I like the rise and rise again until lambs become lions. That really is the core of my heartbeat in all of this. Because without that call to hope, without that drive to walk towards truth, and it's not an irrational hope. It's not, I mean, maybe one could argue that me trying to get this on the Super Bowl or World Cup was a bit irrational, but the point is that the hope that we move to is an animated living hope. And everything that we do must drive us towards that point. And so much of this, to me, I have the picture in my mind, both through the book and the movie, of where Aslan in the Chronicles of Narnia breathes his breath of life on things and people and creatures that are stone, and that animates. And that's what I want to see through this. I want to see the sleepers awake. I want to see the dead be made alive. I want to see those who are just out of touch with what it is to be human animated once more. And so, going back to what we were discussing a little bit before, just about the cultural shifts, I think a lot of the problem is that even in countries and cultures that are traditionally pro-life, it's more of a cultural reason. And you can see that even in how a lot of girls are dealt with in many countries that are extremely pro-life. Once the girls are born, they're treated like human waste through the preponderance of their life. So again, this can't just be a set of ideals that we cling to, or some agreement that we come to. There has to be something deeper that animates and that quickens the spirit. And that's why I know that this is being directed by the Lord's hand, that the hearts of those involved are being moved by the Lord's hand. The timing was the Lord's timing. I don't know where this would have gone if I had been able to launch this with the Super Bowl and then COVID happened. I don't know what would have happened. Maybe I wouldn't have been so motivated to keep going. And this would have ended with an audience of 100 million Americans. And maybe this would have been kept as, an America focused project. I really don't know. But the way the Lord worked this out, and my sights were on the 2022 World Cup. This World Cup is far bigger than that one was. And there's a halftime show. For the first time in World Cup history, I think maybe in the early 90s, there may have been some kind of semblance of a halftime show, but there's a halftime show now that's going to draw even more people in. And just for the final alone, the live final, they are projecting a viewership of 1.5 billion people just for the final. That's not even talking about the other 104 matches that are going to be happening. So this is clearly the Lord's push, the Lord's animation, and I'm blown away too.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And I'm with you that there's an imperative there. We are prisoners of hope, literally. Like we're captive by hope. We can't not be a people of hope. That is the story. And so I'm with you that it's not just a feeling or a lighthearted, like we should, try to conjure this up. It's like, no, this is us. And we've been saying it forever. We can build cathedrals. We can write symphonies. We can paint the world's most incredible fine art. We can and let the human person be animated in ways that are absolutely extraordinary and fill the world with the glory of God. And we can shift the global conversation about abortion to a conversation that leads toward a culture of life. We literally can watch that take place. And you're standing right now at a moment where there's an opportunity literally to take a step towards that with the World Cup in view. That viewership is incredible to me. Like the fact that you could introduce this conversation, and I'm thoughtful, here we are so close to the Christmas season and in the fullness of time, right? God always does these things in the fullness of time, and he has his reasons why this World Cup, not that World Cup, why the expansion of this audience. He knows when this conversation should take place, and it feels like this is the moment. What's the domino run? Just help people understand who maybe they go, okay, I'm with you. I see what you're trying to do, and I understand the strategy behind shifting this conversation and introducing faces of survivors to shift the conversation and reintroduce them to that hierarchy. so that we're with you. We see this incredible opportunity from an American audience to a global audience, from hundreds of millions to billions. Okay, I'm with you. For that person who's like, okay, so Lyric, what do we do? Like, how does something like this happen? What are the steps that you're taking right now, or what's that domino run to go from today to all of us sitting and watching the World Cup and going, it happened. We're watching these faces and these stories appear.
It's kind of a funny paradigm, Zach. 5, 6 years ago when this was happening, we had the finances. We had what we needed to move forward. We didn't have the approval. Now we're starting in the reverse. We're starting with the approval and now we're moving towards the finances. So it's a bit of a flip, and it's kind of funny how the Lord works, because I don't think there's any dynamic where he's going to say it's all going to work out. You don't have to really really work your faith muscle. So we're doing that. Um a viewership of most of the world isn't inexpensive. We're looking at a range between 10 to $15 million. There are some different packages, some different matches that we can go for. And what I mean by matches are not the World Cup matches. When you make these types of media buys, you're also required by the networks to make matching buys for other types of situations. So what's going to run on the World Cup and reach all of this viewership is not the only place Faces of Choice commercials would show. There will also be other, whether it's something like, and I'm not saying this is it, but if it's something like Good Morning America or something like that, there are going to be many other matching buys that must correlate with this buy. So again, that's how we're getting, not just the billions for the World Cup, but outside from that, people are going to be reintroduced to this in other venues. So that's the first step. I know a lot of people, especially in the month of December, which is, I appreciate you having me on now, that is a time where people are asking their families and the Lord, where do you want us to direct resources? And I would encourage you to prayerfully consider this, especially if the life issue is something that means something to you and you are stepping into this vision and realizing the potential that we have for impact. So that's probably the most important part of where we are now. Final discussions are actually going to be happening today and tomorrow in terms of bringing all the contracts together and signing things on the dotted line and moving forward. And it's interesting how you were earlier talking about how the Lord has very specific timing in Christmas, and how he brings things together in a way that it's not some kind of superstitious thing, but it's just his way of connecting with us as humans, because tomorrow is the day that I'm actually supposed to be signing on the dotted line moving forward. We've already received the approval, but I have some things on my end to shore up. And tomorrow is actually my grandmother's birthday. And the reason that matters to me in the context of all of this is that my background on my mom's side is Greek. And my grandmother's name was Zoe, which means life in Greek. And my grandmother was actually born dead. My great grandmother was in her mid 40s when she had my grandmother. And my grandmother was blue when she came out of the womb. She had basically asphyxiated. I think there was an umbilical cord situation, and they were trying to resuscitate my grandmother. And my great grandmother said, Lord, if you give me this child back, I'll give her to you. And my grandmother gasped and began to breathe. And that's when my great grandmother just shouted out the name Zoe, which means life in Greek. And that
Mm.
became her name. So the fact that all of this is just kind of coming together for me in this final contract signing dynamic on December 5th, my grandmother's birthday, Zoe's birthday, is just another indicator to me of the Lord's hand of life through all of this. And, my parents were involved in the pro life movement in the 80s and 90s. And my mother had actually produced a sign that said pro life, the real choice for woman and child. And so all of these things are just echoing in my mind now as I'm going forward and stepping into this, and just realizing it's not just the king's heart that's in the Lord's hands. My life is in the Lord's hands. My time is in his keeping. Your life is in his hands. Your time is in his keeping. And I think that that is what gives us freedom to hope. um, I'm a very type A personality, in case you can't tell. I like to get things done. But there is also a freedom and a peace that I don't think would otherwise be afforded in situations like this. The Lord gives us reason to hope. He doesn't just give us hope to toy with us in some kind of cat and mouse game. He gives us reason to hope. And even if things don't come together in the way that we had hoped or anticipated or expected, he's in control, and there's a lot at play with that brings peace. So circling back to your question and the dominoes, right now we're trying to figure out the funding dynamic. We're moving forward in faith. We do have until um, June or May of next year to bring forward the full amount. But that's where we're stepping out in faith right now and moving forward. We're not We're not, Budweiser or Coca-Cola walking into this, as a fully funded entity with millions or billions at our fingertips. But the Lord will provide.
Yeah. No, it's so, again, what I'm so grateful for the opportunity to know you and to just to enter into a conversation, and this is your call, this is the particular way that God is animating your life, and we get to participate together in it. I'm Zach Elliott, Executive Director of VUVIVO, and together with our partners, we are recovering the deep Christian tradition of standing behind the arts by making significant investment in visual art, music, and literature. We're working together with some of the world's most gifted fine artists, composers, and authors to wondrously reveal Christianity and invite people to know God personally. This work to recover the tradition of standing behind the arts is going to take a fresh generation of patrons committed to resourcing and releasing these great artists to use the highest and best of their gifts to the glory of God and for the good of the world. You can join us in that work by becoming a V3 partner. Reach out for more information or go to vuvivo.com/support to join us in standing behind the arts. But what's so fun, I love about this, I really am excited about the reality that people have said forever, like our moment at the edge of the modern age, right, is a disenchanted moment. There's a malaise. We've drained the universe of meaning and significance. And that's kind of the atmosphere that all of us have come of age in. But we know that that's not the story. The story is actually much more potent, and it's dancing and tingling, a festival, not a cold machine, as Lewis said. We are participating in something extraordinary, and we get to do it together. We get to meet someone like Lyric who is standing at the edge of this incredible opportunity, and we get to all kind of partner together and play a part. And to do that, it is what makes life meaningful and charges it with significance and potency. And that's an extraordinary gift that is given to us when courageous people stand up and point. Like I've heard it said that a leader's most important work is to point and to say, let's go in that direction. And whether it's I have a dream or we just point. And when we see these figures in history, Lyric, you being one of them, I think there's an invitation for us to say, I'm going to add my yes to that and participate in some way. So if you're listening, I want to invite you to, again, prayerfully consider how can you be a part of this movement with Faces of Choice. And facesofchoice.org is where you go to connect with the organization. And I will tell you this, even from V3's work, when someone reaches out and even just says, hey, I'm with you, I'm praying for you, and I heard your story and I want you to know it impacted me, don't give up, don't grow weary in doing good. What happens to a figure like Lyric when you send that message is extraordinary. When you say, hey, I don't have a lot, but I have $100 and I will send my $100 and say, God, take that and multiply it. But I believe that we should shift the conversation about life and from a culture of death to a culture of life. And I want to be a part of that. And so I'll bring what I have and believe, God, you'll do the rest. What happens on the other side of it is faith is stirred up, and someone like Lyric has the confidence to sign those contracts and to say, I believe God will do it. And so let's not miss that. Sometimes we hear things like, don't miss the days of the humble beginnings, and don't despise those days. And those become quaint sayings. But these are those moments where we go, how did little conversations, big acts of faith, but really giant goals get accomplished? And we see like it was one by one, people believing God, saying, okay, I believe, let's go in that direction. But somebody has to go first. And Lyric, you've done it. The other thing I appreciate about this is the way you're telling a story, right? We believe in leading with beauty and the power of a story to help us discover what is good so we can know what is true. And the way you are filming, shooting, and introducing these stories, there's artistry there that really, there's a craft to storytelling. Talk just a little bit about how you'll approach these commercials, telling these stories, How will you do that, and who will be involved? I know you can't say everything about who will be involved, but the other thing we appreciate is the artistry going into leading with beauty as you go out and introduce this storytelling approach that brings a new character to the fore. How are you doing that, and who's involved in the storytelling aspect?
That's a great question, Zach. It kind of goes, and I'm going to jump back a little bit. I've talked about how this has been a long process for me in terms of since 2019. But if you really want to jump back to the origins of when this became a conversation, you'd have to go back to the 1980s. And if you want to talk about stories, there was a Pulitzer Prize nominated work called Abortion, the Dreaded Complication. There were two journalists who went through trying to discern what the nature was of children who were surviving abortions. And they were finding things like in Glasgow, Scotland, there was a child who survived an abortion who was put in a brown paper bag in the dead of winter, put outside next to an incinerator, and was waiting to be burned alive after having survived this abortion. A janitor found this child. The baby did not make it, but it was actually tended to over the next day before it passed away. There is one story after the other of this. To where they were estimating that at least one baby a day was surviving a surgical abortion. That's not even talking about the other types of abortions. I mentioned earlier in this conversation the saline infusion abortion. Um, Lots of children survive those types of abortions. So we're estimating at least close to 100,000 living survivors of abortion right now in America alone. That's not talking about through the rest of the world. And the thing is, if you're talking about this, and it's the imagery with the fire and the incinerator just strikes me because everything about this is beauty from ashes. And so when I read these stories in the Pulitzer Prize nominated work, all I saw was death and ashes and suffering and cover-ups and hiding these stories and misery. And that's very real, and our culture needs to grasp that. But what I want people to understand when you look a survivor in the eye is the beauty, that we don't want to perpetuate these ashes. We want to recognize the beauty. And if you go to our website, facesofchoice.org, or the YouTube channel, and you listen to these people's stories of survival and the absolute beauty that has come from their lives. One lady was actually weeping as she gave her story because she said, it's bad enough that I wouldn't have been here, but my children wouldn't be here. And then she went on to talk about the incredible things that they've accomplished and how they have effectuated good things in the world as very young teenagers. So there is an arc that must start with the ashes because beauty as the phoenix must rise from it. But that is what I wanted to bring to play in this. And the commercial that I ended up writing, the way that it came to mind, the Lord, I think I told you before, actually brought it to me in the middle of the night, like years back. And I sat up in the middle of my bed at like 2 a.m. I wrote down the script. I went back to bed and I forgot about it for a couple of years. But in bringing this together, and I have a wonderful videographer that I've been working with, and just it's been a really good dynamic. But I wanted to convey, it's in black and white. I wanted to convey that there is this ashes or this dark element that we're talking about, but I also wanted to show the beauty of their faces. If you look at the commercial, you are struck by the angles, by the lighting, by the close-ups. They're all very attractive, wonderful people, and you really get that. And it's not just the face, it's the animated life inside of their eyes in realizing I wasn't supposed to be here and I am. And I think that these people savor life differently than perhaps many of us do. And you can see that in just the basic engagement with who they are. So that's kind of the scope that I was trying to direct, that there is a beauty from ashes art that is tangible and real. But we do have, and I can't, as I was talking with you before we went on, there is the potential for two very well-known people to possibly take part in this. And if that goes forward, and I would ask people, there's so little information that I'm giving, but I would ask you to pray hard for this because this has the potential to affect this situation in an even greater way that I can't even articulate how impactful it would be. So please pray that both of those are yes responses. But actually, Zach, something I hadn't even mentioned to you yet that maybe I can tell you later offline. Um, we have plans after the World Cup, if the World Cup is successful, for something that would be, I would say, even a step up from this. And it
Mm.
is contingent in large part on this going forward. But this is not just going to end with the World Cup bid and then walking away. This is a narrative that must continue and is rooted in beauty, and there is a storytelling arc to it that I'm seeing in all of these things and the people that I've been blessed to be surrounded by as we're dialoguing about this. This is not just going to stop with the sports commercial. There's something actually bigger that I would like to do next, starting in 2027. But we need prayerful support desperately and deeply. We need financial support as well moving forward. And um, life empowers, which is what the abortion survivor Melissa Oden says with her Abortion Survivors Network. She brings abortion survivors together and connects them, because that's another thing with the story element, Zach, is that so many of them have felt alone and isolated and like they're an anomaly, and they just happen to be the one random person whose mother didn't want them so much that she tried to kill them, and they survived. And they walk in that. They walk in that shame and that guilt and that rejection. But in hearing these stories and realizing this isn't an anomaly, there are, at least 100,000 of you, but probably a lot more just in this country. That power of story and humanity and emotion and connection, again, is working at the fabric of this nation to bring healing and
Yeah,
hopefully the world.
yeah, well said. I know we can't talk about all the characters in this story, but I do know two of the names that you're referring to. You and I talked about it before, and I will just say I was struck with every life is beautiful, and that's what I love about the campaign, the storytelling, what you're doing. You're bringing beauty from ashes and letting us see that arc, and it's really well done. So the artistry there and the thoughtfulness is so wonderful, and then the reality of what God has done in every person. That life is beautiful. It is human life is so beautiful, and to revere it, to wonder at it, to cherish it. It is an invitation for all of us to just remember that even in our own lives and not take any human life for granted and just be a yes to the beauty of life. And when we get to know these stories personally, we're always stunned, and it gives us a moment to say, I never would have imagined. And for people who feel like they're alone in this story or they have a story like this in their family, I think some of the ways that you're bringing out some of these stories allow people to say, I would have never imagined. And I think I'm going to join you in prayer that you have an opportunity to highlight these stories, not because these people are more important than any other life, but the reach and scope of some of the work that has been done in and through them will just say, oh, this is a life that has impacted the world in a particular way that never would have been there. And it's just so obvious how precious life is. So, Lyric, thank you. I think all of us feel the urgency of the moment. And so I want to be careful with your time, but I want to leave it with this for everybody listening. These are those opportunities that come around and we go, wow, I think in the fullness of time, we've got the approval. And there's a cultural moment where people are leaning and shifting ever so slightly from a culture of death to a culture of life. What if? What if there's somebody who rises and points and says, let's go? And now's our moment. And we all join in that. What could happen? And so I want to just extend my invitation to do this. Write down Faces of Choice and Lyric Gillett. Just write those two names down and commit with me, if you will, to pray for Lyric and Faces of Choice, and just pray. Second thing I would say is go to the website and listen to the stories. Just familiarize yourself with the organization, with the stories, and just allow yourself to take that one step. And then third, I would say, let's bring what we have. There's an opportunity here to participate. And it's so wonderful to see what could be if we don't think about what we don't have, but we bring what we do have. And I think that that's what I get excited about. You hear numbers like 10 million, 15 million. And for most of us, I can't write that check. But I can participate, and I can pray, and I can bring what I have. And I think if everybody listening did that, this would be done. I mean, to the scale, think about it. I mean, to some, we can cut $1 million check. To some, we can cut a $5 million, $10 million check, and we can do it. To others of us, we can cut a $5 check, or we can give $1. And if we all just give our yes, it's amazing what God does. And so I would just give you that invitation. Please write down Faces of Choice, Lyric Gillett. Go to facesofchoice.org, and then let's bring what we have and just see what God will do. But Lyric, thank you for your leadership. I really do respect your thoughtfulness and the way you approach everything you do. I really respect you for the way you go about your work. one. Two, your courage is beautiful. Like the life and beauty of the gospel, the courage that you have to rise again, to get back up, and to stay in this over time, over years. We just admire that and want to say, keep going, don't grow weary. And thank you for just being who you are in the world. And we're with you and for you. So maybe we can jump back on. This is an ongoing, unfolding story. So we'll just put a pin in it, a comma behind it, and say we'll come back. But Lyric Gillett, thank you for your work in the world and just sharing time with us. We're grateful.
Thank you, Zach, and I'm so grateful to you and Cami for the ministry and the incredible organization that you have, because I think that the way the world has defined beauty is so off, and the way that you 2 are actually showing, it's almost tasting and seeing what is good, and I'm so grateful for your work in that.
Yeah. Well, we're grateful for you, and we'll put a comment to keep the conversation going. How about that?
Thank you so much, Zach.